May I ask if I can be able to share my screen with you so that I can show the slides that I have?
You can share your screen, sir.
Okay, wonderful. I think someone has to make me a co-host in order for me to be able to do that. And there
No.
it is.
Yep.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me. This is a pleasure. I appreciate you squeezing me in here. It's Black History Month, and as you might imagine, given what I do, I am quite busy. I'm on Zoom calls back to back all day, almost every day. So thank you for including me in your schedule. Today, I'm going to talk about African-American history and our experience in Arizona. And this is going to be something of a whirlwind presentation because I'm going to start 2.6 million years ago, believe it or not, and rocket us up until the 20th and 21st century so you can get a sense of how deeply rooted African-American history is in this state. I want to begin with a quote from Socrates, which my mother introduced me to as a child. She was a social studies teacher for 37 years, and we had very interesting conversations at the dinner table. This quote reads, "I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think." She encouraged me along the way to go into education, and I fought it tooth and nail, but I eventually succumbed to destiny and pursued a career in academics. But the point of this is to suggest that throughout this talk, hopefully I will challenge you to think a little bit differently about African-American history, and particularly African-American history in Arizona. It comes as a surprise to a lot of people that there's enough history to research and to be able to share with others in Black history in Arizona. But what I've learned in my experience is that the more that I learn, the more that I realize I don't know. I want to also share with you a quote from the late, great John Henrik Clarke, a wonderful historian of the African diaspora, that is the dispersal of people of African descent throughout the world. And he told us that the events which transpired 5,000 years ago, 5 years ago or 5 minutes ago, have determined what will happen 5 minutes from now, 5 years from now, or 5,000 years from now. And this is the part that I love the most. All history is a current event. The idea that there is a separation between the past, present, and future is really a human construction. Everything that was done 5,000 years ago, 5 minutes ago, has an impact on the present. And of course, the present has an impact in the future. And the same can be said for African-American history, particularly African-American history in Arizona. In the beginning, about 2.6 million years ago, the first creatures to be classified as part of the human species, the Homo erectus, evolving from the Australopithecus, evolved in Africa, Northeast Africa. And you can see on your screen here the area that is now modern Egypt, Sudan, Somalia. That area there is where the first humans evolved from. Based upon sharp tools of flint, they introduced what became known as the Stone Age in this area. And why is this important? Because this is the place from which all human beings evolved. It's certainly the place from which people of African descent in America evolved, more recently connected to those who ultimately migrated outside of that area in Northeast Africa to West Africa. For those of you who are interested in tethering Black history to scripture, I would note that in Genesis, it refers to the Garden of Eden and the land of Cush. The area of Northeast Africa in the region that we're talking about now housed Cush. Some have argued that the Garden of Eden was in fact where the place where human beings evolved, if you're a follower of scripture. But that is not in conflict with science and the evolution of human beings as we now know. 1 million years ago, Homo sapiens explored outward out of Africa into what is now the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and into Europe. Those cousins of sub-Saharan Africa left and populated those regions of the world. Paintings on stone slabs found in Nambia date back 30,000 to 30,000 BC. Rock cave paintings survived from 8,000 BC in the modern Sahara. And around 3,000 BC, and this is key, a climate shift, which lasted more than a millennia, gradually turned the Sahara to desert. So for those who are saying, well, it couldn't have been the Garden of Eden was described as being lush and fertile, then it couldn't be because Sahara and that area is nothing but desert now. Well, it wasn't more than 3,000 years ago. What has been left from the recession of the waters in that fertile period is a Nile River Valley, which the sediment is rich from all of the things that settled into that particular area. And for thousands of years, that Nile River Valley was considered to be the breadbasket of the world. Stay with me now, because I'm going to get to the west coast of Africa and get us to Arizona in the next 5 minutes. Egypt, I'm sorry? I thought I heard someone say something. Okay, that was probably just a microphone. One of those first societies that was created was Egypt. There were other societies, Kush, Meroe, Axum. Egypt, however, has been cited as one of the first quote unquote civilized societies in human history. And what we know is that people of sub-Saharan African descent were very much a part of ancient Egypt. For years, we were taught directly and indirectly that Egypt was, in fact, in some cases, not in Africa. Many people had positioned it in the Middle East, and that the peoples of Egypt were not peoples of color, let alone Black people, but Europeans. Look no further than some of those films like Cleopatra starring the late Elizabeth Taylor, all the way up until about 10 years ago with Sigourney Weaver playing Nefertiti. But the papyrus that we see in front of us, I've been to Egypt, I've been in the tombs, I've seen the hieroglyphs and the writings. I've also studied the research into what you see at the top right, which is a 3D scan, a forensic scan of the remains of the so-called boy king who lived about 3,000 years ago. And you can tell from this rendering that he was very much a person of color. Why is this important? Because if in our studies, we begin our history of humankind with Western civilization, which is still pretty much the recipe for teaching history, we will begin with Greece, Rome, moving forward to the inhabiting of Europe, Western Europe, the creation of wonderful documents like the Magna Carta, which inspired writers like Rousseau and Locke, who inspired our own Thomas Jefferson and our own documents of freedom. But if you only understand that lineage, people of color, which are 2/3 of the people of the planet, will be nothing more than sidekicks and sycophants to the great white civilizations of old. But those early Arizonans, people of African descent in Arizona, were descendants of great civilizations. Egypt is known for one of the first dominant powers in maritime trade, trading in goods and minerals and farming. We all know about their architecture. Pharaoh Akhenaten is cited as being the creator of monotheism, even though in the area of what is now modern Uganda, going back 36,000 years, there were some African peoples who worshiped one God, one deity. Egypt is also known for being the creator of what is now international law, one of the first treaties and international law efforts stemmed out of Egypt. Now let's move forward, because those other kingdoms that evolved following Egypt, I'm going to move us quickly up to the 15th century, included ancient Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Zimbabwe, the Great Swahili Coast, all the way up into the 15th century, which of course is when people of Europe, Western Europe descent, came in contact, quote unquote, with sub-Saharan African peoples on the west coast of Africa. Modern day Djibouti, Cameroon, Nigeria, Ghana, Benin, those areas. And through the process of one of the most vicious forced extractions of the people in human history, somewhere between 8 and 20 million people of African descent, based upon either the import numbers, Europeans, or export numbers, generated by African peoples. The transatlantic slave trade was just remarkably brutal. Only about 600,000 people of African descent came to what is now the United States. The vast majority of them went to what is now Brazil, which houses the largest African population, people of African descent, I should say, outside of the continent of Africa. Now, of those 600,000 people who came to what is now the United States or were brought here, one of them was Estebanico de Dorantes, who was born in Anzamar, Morocco in 1639. He was sold into slavery, was taken to Europe. He already spoke 2 languages or 3 languages at the time. He learned Spanish in addition to Portuguese and became a guide to those conquistadors who claimed to have discovered America. There were already some 500 indigenous nations here who knew quite well where they were, but nevertheless, Estebanico helped guide them from what is now Florida around the Gulf Coast into Veracruz in Mexico, establishing one of the first Black communities in the so-called New World. And of course, he migrated northward up into what is now Arizona in the 15th century. And this is key. Why did I go through all of this? Because Black people have been in Arizona longer than anyone other than the indigenous people who trace their lineage back more than 30,000 years. This flies in the face of popular perception that we are somehow perpetual guests, not only in Arizona, but America, that we are not of Arizona and America. We are in Arizona or America. After that, we see a larger migration of people of African descent to what is now Arizona via the Buffalo Soldiers in the 9th and 10th Cavalry, those former Civil War fighters for the Union who were placed at what is now Fort Huachuca in southern Arizona, a little bit closer to where you all are in Tucson, which became the hub of the largest population of Black soldiers in the US all the way up through World War II. Notwithstanding, no disrespect to the Tuskegee Institute, the Tuskegee Airmen, even those folks trained at what became Luke Air Force Base in southern Arizona. So you had these Buffalo Soldiers, former cowboys, opening up the West in Arizona, laying telegraph wire, escorting Wells Fargo banking wagons, extracting water from canals that had been dug by the ancient Hohokam that were still here. The West was settled not only by the rough and tumble, rugged individualists like John Wayne, they were also settled by people of color, in particular, Black folks like the Buffalo Soldiers. Called Buffalo Soldiers, by the way, by indigenous people because their hair resembled that of the buffalo, which wasn't an insult. It was actually a compliment because the buffalo were seen as these sort of reverent, mystical figures with quite a lot of esteem by indigenous populations. Buffalo Soldiers. Some key places and figures moving forward. McNairy, Arizona, up north, became a hub for Black migrants from Alabama who were lumber workers. There's a book called The Tribe of Ulysses that talks about how great they were at logging. And they moved to McNairy to do just that. There are some descendants that are left. They are starting to leave us, but there are some that are still left up in McNairy, and they speak an interesting sort of Gullah dialect because those lumberers that moved here had descendants who were from the Alabama coast. Benjamin McClendon is cited as the first person in the census as being a person of African descent in Arizona. I've already told you about Estebanico. We learned about Estebanico not from American sources, but from Mexican sources and resources from their archives. But Benjamin McClendon walked here with his ox from North Carolina in 1847. Yes, he walked here with his ox all the way from North Carolina. In Yuma, you have the Dees family, which became one of the largest cattle raising families in the United States. And in fact, if you were an Arizonan for decades and you ate beef, you probably ate some of the prize beef that the Dees family raised. Their success ruffled a lot of feathers and was an offense to many whites in the area. So much so that one year their prize steer was castrated and had his horns cut off on their farm. It was during the period of Jim Crow and virulent racism, and they were no exception. Mary Green was the first person of African descent in Phoenix, 1868. She moved here from North Carolina. She's also one of the first Black entrepreneurs in the state. When she stopped being a domestic worker for the Columbus Gray family, she opened a stand near what is now Talking Stick Arena in Phoenix and sold wares and cold drinks, which I'm sure went over really well in this hot desert out here in Arizona. Her granddaughter was the founder of Arizona's Black Theater Troupe. If you've taken any of their plays, there is a direct connection between the Black Theater Troupe and the first person of color to live in Phoenix, Black person. Richard Rosser moved here from the South in 1893. He worked for the Arizona Biltmore as a bellhop. He saved his money and then bought some land in downtown Phoenix and bequeathed that land to Tanner AME Church, 1899, that should say, which is the oldest predominantly Black Baptist church in the state, followed by the first institutional Baptist church pictured here in 1905. Elizabeth Hudson Smith moved here in 1897. She's a Black woman, entrepreneur. She purchased the Vernetta Hotel, which is the picture on top here, and became renowned for her cooking. People came from all over the state to eat her food. She invested the money she made as a popular restaurateur and hotel owner in a local gold mine, silver mine. She became the postmaster in Wickenburg. She opened a farm and became quite wealthy. She actually put a number of the young white people in Wickenburg through college. She and her husband were the only Black people in the city. Unfortunately, with the second rising of the Klan and a white nationalist movement in America between 1915 and 1919, there was a movement to cast her as a madam, which she was not. People started boycotting her services, and the Presbyterian church that she helped found in Wickenburg actually kicked her out and ostracized her. Despite all of that, she still died right around 1919, I believe, with an estate that would be worth right around $1.6 million now. But when you talk about Black entrepreneurship, particularly successful women in Arizona history, very few people know about Elizabeth Hudson Smith. But she did what she did as a woman and as a Black person and as a migrant from Chicago in the late 19th century and early 20th century. We know that segregation was an issue in Arizona. It was legalized by the territorial legislature in 1909. The Phoenix School Board enacted segregation as well. Other parts of the state, most parts of the states adopted segregated practices. My first book is a history of the civil rights movement in Phoenix. I share with folks that despite this, Arizona was a place of hope for people of African descent, because even though the race relations were imbalanced and marred by quite a bit of racism, the race relations were a bit more fluid here than they were in the South. Didn't mean it didn't exist, racism. It just meant that there were fewer people of African descent, and there was a bit more fluidity and nuance and upward mobility for Black folks because of their low numbers. Now, what was the reality of Jim Crow? Black folks fought back to create the colored department within Phoenix Union High School District. That led to the creation of the Phoenix Colored School. It also led to the creation of other schools like Dunbar School in Tucson. There was a segregated school in Flagstaff. The Phoenix Colored School eventually would evolve into the Carver High School in 1943 in Phoenix, named after the famous scientist George Washington Carver. I was the president of their board of directors for some time, about 15 years ago. Carver became a museum and cultural center in the early 1990s. We also know there's another entrepreneur and journalist, Ara Hackett, operated the Arizona Gleam newspaper, a newspaper by and for people of African descent in 1919. All of the journalists, all of the editors, and she is the owner, were Black women. Again, another woman that most people in Arizona, even advocates for women's history, don't know about. We were also segregated residentially, in employment, public accommodations, even in cemeteries. I don't even want to be dead next to you, which is a horrible statement for the reality of segregation at the time. But it was true in hospitals and in churches. And signs like this were not uncommon throughout the Southwest. And I have one that's specific to Arizona that says no dogs, no Negroes, and no Mexicans allowed. But segregation didn't define everything for people of African descent. They fought back. This is Opal Ellis, who led one of the first sit-ins in the United States in 1945. This is 16 years before Greensboro. Okay. And at the time, she was a teenager that she led this protest. I believe she was 14. The first successful sit-in, by the way, was in Wichita, Kansas in 1947. So Black folks all the way out here in the West were doing more than punching doggies and running from Gila monsters or whatever it is people think that Westerners do, that all Westerners do. They were actually creating movements to affirm their own dignity and self-worth. And by the way, I'm a native. I was born and raised here in Phoenix. And growing up, I had friends that I met in high school that sort of thought that we all had Gila monsters in our backyards and rattlesnakes chasing us down our suburban streets. World War II changed everything for Black folks here, just like it changed the world. To see the Tuskegee Airmen were very influential. Lincoln Ragsdale moved here from Oklahoma after a stint at Fort Huachuca and decided to stay and become one of the leaders in a movement to secure jobs and freedom for Black folks. So that booming migration to the West included Black folks, but it was a relatively small number. But they moved here nevertheless, primarily from Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. This led to heated race relations because of the greater numbers. And those heated race relations led to a civil rights movement to call for more equality. Now, the civil rights movement here was led primarily by people of African descent, but we also had white allies and Latino and Latina allies, Asian American allies, who formed the Greater Phoenix Council for Civic Unity. There was a Greater Tucson Council for Civic Unity. There was a Greater Arizona Council for Civic Unity. They were all over the United States. And they were an interracial group of people that held conversations about and lobbied on behalf of inclusion, particularly in places of public accommodations. The NAACP was active. All of this led to desegregation of schools in 1953, almost 1 year before the Brown decision. Arizona's case was a precedent for the National Brown decision, and most people don't know that. Employment desegregation happened in Arizona in 1962, ahead of the national curve. Dr. King came here in 1964 after having been invited for about 15 years. He was a little busy leading an international movement and desegregation movement, and he was often in jail. So he couldn't make it, but they found an open window and he came. Lincoln Ragsdale here to his right, brought him to Tanner AME Church to talk about civil and human rights. That symbolized an evolution in Black Arizona history and in the United States, because that was 1964. We were a society defined by slavery for 246 years. The era of Jim Crow, which has been referred to as virtual slavery, lasted from 1865 to about 1954 with the desegregation of schools. After that, you had the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Immigration Act of 1966, the Open Housing Act of 1968, which is the culmination of a civil rights movement, right? That changed the law. And so if you look at this green period here, and that green period actually doesn't really start in 1954. Legally speaking, it starts in about 1968. But from 1968 to now, we have been confronted with the legacy of that 346 years of chattel slavery and virtual slavery, which, despite its coercive nature, in many ways was overcome daily by people of African descent, like Ara Hackett, like Mary Green, like Benjamin McClendon, like Estevanico Durantes, going all the way back to the 16th century, who eked out of this mountain of of oppression, some success, which affirmed our humanity, our dignity, and ability to thrive in any environment. And so that's what I wanted to share with you today. I know this was sort of a quick tour de force, but I would be remiss if I wouldn't have started very early on to provide some context for this history here. It goes way back, and it precedes the arrival of the first people of African descent in Jamestown in 1619. But the British weren't particularly interested in what the Spanish were doing. They were only interested in what they were doing. But Black history in the United States did not begin in 1619. It began in the 15th century with Estevanico de Durantes. So thank you. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Whitaker. We had been focused mainly on diversity, equity, and inclusion for the presentation. What have we learned over this history, and what can we do better going forward to make sure that we are inclusive? And I mean, it sounds like we've come a long way over the years, and yet we haven't.
No, exactly. One of the reasons why I went so back in this, we're talking about it. I'm back when I jump off of this, I'm going to be talking to a few hundred people with Merck about a similar topic. And the reality is we can't begin to have a successful diversity, equity, and inclusion movement until we really understand where we've come from, right? Because in some ways, we're still fighting the Civil War by proxy right now with regard to race relations. And that's because we've never really come to terms with the majority of our history. Many people don't understand that Black people have been inextricably linked to or leaders of virtually every movement that has animated our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. So in other words, those things were ratified by 1787, but they meant nothing for the majority of people in the United States, even most white people, because they didn't own land. And you couldn't vote unless you owned land. So all of those amendments that I mentioned, that those were just the ones in the late 19th century and 20th century, Black folks created those. So when you look at corporate America, when you look at New York Life, when you look at the Ivy League, when you look at leading universities, when you look at the most prominent nonprofits, when you look at the faith-based institutions, particularly those, the Christian institutions, African Americans have enlightened them. They have made them possible. At the same time that we've been on the outside looking in with opportunities to advance ourselves. So we have in some ways been the moral compass of America, but not been treated with the necessary respect. And the only way that we are going to survive as a nation, quite frankly, a nation that within the next 30 years will be 69% Black and brown. The only way that we're going to survive is to know this history and to take an equitable approach. And equitable is not equal. Equal and equitable are two totally different things. Equity is giving people what they need to be successful. Equality is this. But given our history, 346 years of this imbalance, the only way that you close the gap is by giving people what they need. And what society needs is an infusion of understanding and opportunity so that people of African descent can compete on a level playing field. And we're just not there yet. And that's the reason why I do this. People want to have this movement in a vacuum without knowledge of our history, and it's just not possible.
All right, thank you. I believe Kathy Mitchell has a question. Kathy?
Yes, thank you for seeing the little hand raised in the corner. So if you look at our Rotary clubs in the United States and particularly in Arizona, since that's who you're speaking with, we are starting on this journey of trying to become more diverse, equitable, and inclusive, and mirror the communities that we want to help serve. So what if you could give us like 2 or 3 pieces of advice as an organization just beginning to really crack this egg? What would you suggest as those beginning steps? Obviously the history you talked about, but what would you do after that? What tangible things would you suggest for us?
Yeah. So after the history, I would read about strategies. So Robin DiAngelo's white privilege, Ibrahim Kendi's stamp from the beginning, right? which talks about the relation to people of color and marginalized people to the dominant population. After that, I would really think about outreach and connections, right? So if your primary goal, what is your primary goal? If your primary goal is to diversify your ranks, then you have to do two things. You have to create a culture that's going to be welcoming for the people who come in. A lot of times, predominantly white organizations want to diversify and bring in diverse people, but they're not prepared basically to receive them and their issues, right? There's a book out there that's called Everything But the Burden. So a lot of folks want Black folks to come in, brown people to come in, indigenous people to come in, and then check all of their concerns and that which tax our minds and, and stares our heart at the door. So you got to ask yourself, are you ready for that? So that Black folks don't have to come in and wear the mask to be a part of the team. And then you have to devise a strategy to get those folks in. And that requires stepping outside of your comfort zone and learning more about where people of color are, Black people are. Do you have a relationship with historically Black colleges and universities or their graduates that are in this area? Do you have a relationship with the Greek organizations, the Black Greek organizations, the Omegas, the Alphas, the Kappas, the AKAs, the Deltas? My mom is a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Do you even know that they exist? Do you know about the links, right? Do you take a look at the predominantly Black newspapers, know what's going on in the organizations? So you got to be targeted in your outreach, because here in Maricopa County, we're 8% of the population. It's a state where we're 5% of the population. And so you got to be targeted. You got to go where we are, particularly the faith-based institutions. So I would say that. And then you got to be ready to take on the challenges that Black folks face. And so the challenge is being targeted. Hate crimes have increased 172% in the last 8 years. Black folks are at the top of that, in addition to indigenous people, brown folks, and Jews. Lynching has not gone away. And so you can't bring us into the organizations and just talk tea and the Oscars and baseball and basketball. We do that. We don't wake up and live our lives in protest, but we also have to deal with those issues. So you all have to have a conversation about your temperature and willingness to engage before you bring folks in. Because people think inward. They think, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a more diverse population? But they're not thinking about what that experience might be for the people who are coming in.
Thank you so much. Like, one of my biggest concerns is kind of what you're speaking to, which is tokenism. And I don't want to see that become what Rotary is, calling ourselves diverse because we have the token.
Yeah.
Few people of color. I really want to see a diverse membership. So thank you. I appreciate that.
No problem. Diversity is the mix. Inclusion is making the mix work. Yep. Equity is making the mix fair. So just because you have folks sitting at the table doesn't mean they're eating. So that's what I would suggest. And I hate to do this, but I'm going to have to jump off. But I would love if if we want to have much more specific DEI talk, I would love to come back and have a conversation with you. Where most of it is just conversation. I actually enjoy that more than anything else. I think you're muted, Wendy.
Let's see. Wendy, I think you're...
Wendy, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry,
Unmute, Wendy.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. So yeah, I'm so sorry we're out of time. For those who do have more questions for you, Doc, should they reach you at your dstrategiesllc.com email?
Actually, yeah, that's right. I'm going to type it into the thing before I get off here, strategiesllc.com. Yeah, right. Email me. I'd love to chat with any of you. You can email me anytime. Our phone number's on the site too. Happy to chat.
All right, so great. Well, on behalf of the Rincon Rotary Club and all of our guests, I'd like to thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise with us. We really appreciate it, and we will ask you back. So we will bid you adieu and wish you well. And so goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. We'll see you later on.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And for our guest, if you would like to receive a copy of this recording, please send me your email in your chat. And thank you again, all of you, for joining us. We really appreciate it. You are welcome to stay logged on as we continue with our business meeting, but if you'd like to get on with your day, we understand. So with that, President Steve, I pass the mic back to you.
Okay, Wendy, thank you very much. And what a insightful speaker he was. A very good brief education, even though it was just 30 minutes. Okay.
I have one really quick question before I jump off.
Oh,
I don't
sure.
think he sent the his email address to everyone. I think it might have just been a private message.
All right, let me give it to you right now.
Okay, perfect.
It is M as in Matthew, W as in Whitaker, at D as in David, strategies, STRATEGIES, LLC.com. So MW at dstrategiesllc.com.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having visitors. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Have a good meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Wendy, thank you very much. This was wonderful.
You're welcome.
I have to hop off too, but thank you guys very much. This was
All right.
great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
We had 50 people on the attending. What a great thing. Okay, so Steve Pettigo here. So just a little bit from me, and we'll do, hopefully we'll have time for Happy Bucks and a little bit from our board. So I want to take this, this is the last meeting of our 8th month, February, and I want to brag about our club a little bit and tell you that we have accomplished many things all the way through the first 8 months here. We have, this is with the VA support this month, we with the No Skid Socks, that's 9 service projects, and that is really cool. That's more than once a month. So we're hoping to do the same thing at the end of this, through the end of this year. And that doesn't count all the Rotary local deliveries that we've also accomplished. And as you all know, Rotary Local is providing many grants with a lot of cash to local classrooms. So we're